If we were put into a very dark room, if our senses were all becoming very unreliable, we don't know what we're doing, we basically don't know who we are. There are these dark, fearful, terrifying things which are trying to seize us and doing their very best to confuse us.
Love the bird there bringing us in. Welcome in. You're in the club. Congratulations. Welcome to the club here. 10 books, book club, book of the year club, I should say. My name's Tim Hill. Joining us, Jack Morgan there on the bottom from the What is Truth podcast, and Jordan Burke up here in the top of your screen as well from Do the Harder Thing podcast. Really appreciate you guys being here with us. Really appreciate you being with us as well. If you're wondering how exactly you join the club, well, you already have. By the way, you're in on this live stream. We're going to discuss the 2023 TAM Book of the Year, Meditations on Death. Going to give away a free copy of the book here today for those of you who are participating. And if you are jumping on this live stream with us, would love to hear your thoughts at any point. Like, for instance, Janet has already said she's looking forward to this webinar. Well, great to have you in, Janet. We're looking forward to discussing this book, specifically Memento Mori, and what that means in the context of this book, and then in the context of just thinking about death in our everyday life. But before we get into that specifically, let's get into our guests here today. Jack, why don't we start with you? Jack Morgan from the What is Truth podcast. Jack, appreciate you being here with us. So why don't you just briefly maybe introduce yourself and give us your general impressions of Meditations on Death, man?
Yeah, that's a great question. Honestly, I don't think that I've ever had to introduce myself, so this is going to be a first for all of us. Let me try and remember my death while I do this intro. So anyways, I am, as you said, Jack Morgan. I am originally from Alabama, actually, where Jordan resides as well. Not to spoil Jordan's intro, but I moved to New York City in the fall of 2021 to join a missionary teaching group called Seton Teaching Fellows, where I just served as a missionary catechist for a year. I continued working for them as a recruitment associate. I kind of winding back a little bit, 2 years prior to that, I had converted to the Catholic faith. And when I converted, I thought, everybody in the world needs to become Catholic. So I decided to launch the What is Truth podcast in my spare time. I sold my Xbox and my PlayStation. I don't know why I had two of them. And then I bought a microphone from Best Buy with the used money. So yeah, that's kind of how I got here today. The What is Truth podcast kind of gained some traction. Yeah, I've been very fortunate to work alongside TAM Books for about a year now. Not like actually employed by y'all, but the promoting sort of the books that you'll put out that are wonderful. And yeah, that's kind of who I am in a brief introduction. As far as my first overall thoughts on the book, one is that this topic seems to be something that God really wants me to think about. I think that he obviously wants all of us to think about this, but I was reflecting on this before the show started and was thinking about how every time I come to this topic, even though a lot of the material you'll read on remembering your death will include visions of hell and sort of imagery that will kind of bring to mind kind of a deathly fear. Despite that, I've always felt strangely consoled by meditating on my death. I have a skull here, not trying to like bring out props or anything, but I have a skull here that I will like look at sometimes, just like stare at, and I'll like realize like I'm gonna be this one day. Like my ancestors may be able to like dig up my skull and my like skeleton one day. And so I'm going to leave my body, hopefully to return to it to the resurrection of the just, but I will leave my body one day, and that is what I will become. And for some reason, that's very consoling for me, because I think that it brings a sense of clarity about who I am as a creature, and about, the fact that one day I will stand and give an account, not just to the creator of the universe, but to all other creatures, about how I lived my life and whether or not I lived it in a way that is becoming of the dignity of being made in the image of God. If I, so to say, was a child of my Father in heaven, or if I was a child of my father who is the devil, depending on which side I end up on there. And so I have really been drawn to the topic every time I get a chance to uh, be exposed to material by the great saints. Because I mean, Jordan's read probably way more saint books than I have, just by the line of work that he's in, and him being being Catholic a little bit longer than I have. But every one of the saints just talks about their death like all the time. So they talk about meditating on their death. So it's definitely something that is clearly a part of God's plan for each and every single one of us. And so whenever Tan sent me this book and announced it was going to be the book of the year, I was super excited. One, because it's a book that, it's not like y'all are just like rehashing some old material. This is a Latin book that if somebody can read Latin, not me, they had access to it. But the English speaking audience that did not know Latin, which is kind of a tragic occurrence in modern day Roman Rite Catholicism. I mean, in order to be Latin Catholic, I've been told by an Orthodox guy, he said that I feel like you can't be a Catholic if you don't know Latin, at least like a Latin Rite Catholic. And so unfortunately we don't know a lot of Latin in the Roman Rite anymore, but I'm really appreciative that this was translated into English. And I don't want to get too much into it because it might ruin some of the rest of the discussion, but I think the first chapter is probably my favorite, and this book will grab you right away and just start really, really giving you stuff to chew on, like really chew on. I mean, I was on a subway when I opened it up for the first time, and I was like, wow. I kind of want to just keep riding on the subway and thinking about this instead of getting off and going to whatever meaningless thing that I'm actually going to. So yeah, I really enjoyed the book.
As I sit here just outside of Charlotte, North Carolina with the book, the idea of you sitting on a subway in New York City, cracking this thing open for the first time is fantastic. One quick question for you, Jack, before we get to Jordan. Not an actual human skull, right? This was the plastic.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, definitely not a human skull. Definitely not a human skull. That is a good qualification, considering the fact that I mentioned my place of work. That thank you for qualifying. Yes, completely. I bought this mea culpa off Amazon. I normally do not buy off Amazon. I try and avoid it, but yeah, this is like $18 on Amazon. So it was like the cheapest skull I could find, and it's like really good. So
a good combination for sure. So Jack's joining us in New York. Let's go all the way down to the bottom, I guess, of the southeast anyway, and that's where Jordan joins us from. I just was, before we hopped on here, talking about at the end of I-85 is Montgomery. Jordan, the host of Do the Harder Thing podcast. Really appreciate you hopping on with us, man. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and then your general thoughts about meditations on death as well?
Yeah, it's great to be here. Yeah, like Jack, I don't tend to introduce myself, so trying to think of exactly what to say in a concise and interesting manner is a little bit difficult. So on the fly, converted to Catholicism in high school, but I never owned it. And what ended up happening was very quickly, I would say, I fell away from the faith. At one point, fell completely away, basically apostatized. I was going to a non-denominational parish, which was horrific. And basically one day I remember sitting in there and felt the call of in my heart. I remember I heard it, but it was a call of my heart. It was, I missed the Eucharist. And I was like, where did that come from? So of course, I traveled down this pathway and reconciled with everything that I had done, because I done a lot of bad, and leaving the church aside, I'd done a lot of bad, and came back with deep fervor because I was granted so much grace and felt really could feel the grace. And it's like rocket fuel, and I've been on fire ever since. Started to do the harder thing, primarily to help guys overcome pornography addiction. And then since then, the way that God tends to work, he starts you in one place, and then he says, okay, cool, you did this, that's awesome, now I want you to go over here. And so now I would say the majority of my work, if not all of it, focuses on spiritual warfare, helping people. I call it lifting the veil off the battlefield, helping them be aware of what's going on, different ways to fight back, and that sort of a thing. And this book, it fits with that in a couple of different ways, not just realizing what's going on, but in terms of what I do in terms of spiritual warfare. It's kind of what Jack alluded to, like, where are you going to go? You know, I asked you basically are going to stand before Jesus, and you're going to hear one of two things, right? You're either going to hear, well done, my good and faithful servant, or depart from me, I never knew you. And if that doesn't make someone shake in their boots, being in Alabama, we have boots, right? I don't know what will. And I think about that often. And I was really intrigued when this came out, because as Jack also mentioned, there's a lot of writings from the saints, and a lot of them mention death, and they mention what you have to do in order to attain union with God. But I haven't necessarily seen any particular text that covers meditation on death in this way. So it was very intriguing, and I read it in about, 30 minutes in adoration, and I was just flipping pages. I mean, it was once you start, it kind of sucks you in, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. So if you haven't seen the book, Jordan is a fast reader, I'm assuming, but it is not a massive tome of any sort. It is relatively small. And I was surprised, guys. I mean, Thomas à Kempis lived, 500 years ago or something like that. But just the relatability of the book. And I guess we need to give the translator, for Father Robert Nixon, a bunch of credit for that, for sure. Just how relatable he made it, and how easy it is to turn those pages, like you mentioned, Jordan. So as we continue on, why don't we narrow our focus just a little bit? And certainly this is not any sort of morose conversation where the focus is only on the dying part of death. It is much broader than that, and much more meaningful, I think. That's the point of having this Book of the Year club, so we can all kind of talk that out together, if you will. But wanted to narrow our focus today specifically on the idea of Memento Mori, and in our TAN podcast on this book, on Meditations on Death, with TAN publisher Connor Gallagher and the translator, like I mentioned, Father Robert Nixon, who we heard his voice there in the trailer as we began. They touched on this specifically. So I wanted to start with that portion of the podcast, and then we'll go from there. Here's Father Robert Nixon and Connor Gallagher talking specifically about Memento Mori.
A lot of Catholic artwork of St. Jerome, working on his writings, and he always had this skull on his desk, or he's holding a skull, talking to it. Memento Mori, remember that you will die.
So remember,
A kind of a common practice, I think, amongst the great saints, is they really did things to remind themselves that the end was near.
Of that. And I think it puts everything in so much perspective. Often we can get ourselves enmeshed in things which seem to matter so much, but when we put it in the context of the fact that we're going to, we're not going to be here forever, we think, well, does it really matter so much? What are the ultimate things? What really matters in the context of the inevitability of death and everything that lies beyond it?
So again, that's just part of a much more wide-ranging conversation that Connor and Father Robert had when he came to visit from Australia several months ago here just outside of Charlotte and TAN headquarters. Catherine just hit us up, said great timing for the publication of this book. Our great Austin Institute for Marriage and Family has been sponsoring a book club this semester, The Lost Art of Dying. And Jack, since you showed off your skull, why don't you lead us off here with the idea of Memento Mori? And the concept to me really is trying to marry the two things, right? How you avoid obsessing about death and only being anxious about it or doing it in a negative way, or thinking about it kind of like we just heard Connor and Father Robert talking about, where it can guide you and, like you were speaking about earlier, almost be a comfort for you in life.
Yeah. Well, one, I forgot the woman's name who just commented, but that's a great book, The Lost Art of Dying. I haven't read through all of it, but I know the author has a lot of stuff online on YouTube. Good Catholic woman, and it just deals with kind of how our culture has lost the art of dying well. We send people into, like hospitals instead of into our homes to die. So like we send our relatives away to die, which is a very inhumane thing. So definitely check that book out if you want to learn more about just death itself, and how to die well. But I'm sure Jordan will be able to hit on this in a second, because what you're saying about the sort of balancing it out. I'm sure that Jordan comes across people all the time who are very anxious or very, I guess, neurotic, that get really obsessed with demons, or like get really afraid of, spiritual warfare and demonic activity. And so there's always like the two extremes. Either people like get way too obsessed with something, like obsessing over like thinking about death to the point where it produces like anxiety, or they go to the opposite extreme where they just don't think about it at all. So that's kind of how, Satan works, is he wants to either get people too obsessed with demons, or he wants people to believe that they don't exist. And I would say there's a very similar attitude when it comes to death, which makes sense. And so, yeah, I think that for me, this kind of the whole idea of Memento Mori being a source of comfort started whenever I heard about a practice that monks do in certain parts of Christendom, and that is that they take a bunch of wood and they make their own tombs. So they like make the casket that they will use for their burial, and they will think about their death while they're doing that. And I mean, first thing to be warned of, you are supposed to do this under the direction of a spiritual director or spiritual father. So don't go out there and try and build your tomb right now unless you talk to a priest and like pray about that a lot, because it can be spiritually dangerous. But just that idea really struck me, because I don't think about my death a lot. Like I genuinely don't. And even after reading this book, like I still struggle. I mean, I'm sure we all struggle to think about our death. I think that's kind of part and parcel of the fact that we, are sick with sin. And so in our sickness with sin, we like to go beyond our limits as a creature. And part of going beyond your limits as a creature is, neglecting the fact that you will die. So I really do a poor job of thinking about my death typically. And so whenever I was reading this book, I was very comforted by the fact that, I will die, and that death isn't the end, but it is a passage into what can be transfigured life. And that passage depends upon how I act within this life. And so if I avoid my death, if I avoid thinking about and meditating upon my death, then I am sentencing myself to end up on the wrong side of that judgment. I am avoiding the reality that every single one of my actions will be put in front of the light. I remember one time Father Ripperger, I think like 2 years ago, I was listening to a podcast he did. I think maybe one of my friends like turned him on in the background, but he was talking about how at the Last Judgment, every single one of the things that we've ever done, every single thought we've had, everything, every action of ours, every movement of our heart, every inclination of our soul will be put on display in front of the entire universe, so that God can give justification for all of the evil that he allowed, as well as for all of the good which he did. And so we'll all see everything with the sort of clarity. But I remember that the Spirit of God kind of implanted upon me that idea that like I would die, and that everybody would see my actions. And so I remember just hearing those words from Father Ripperger, like I would notice like a week later, whenever there was a moment for me to like tell a white lie or like maybe like do something that I know I shouldn't be doing. And I realized that like, oh crap, like one day everybody's going to see that. So it's not like I'm escaping. It's not like I'm being sly. And that like led me to really act differently. And I think that's kind of what I get a lot out of this book whenever it touches on the topic of remembering your death, is that you know, you are going to have to give an account for everything which you've ever done, and that occurs at the moment of death. So really, uh, remembering our death gives us a sense of clarity and direction about where we want our life to go. And so it allows for us in the midst of this kind of nihilistic society and this seemingly, I mean, you know, I mean, even the author of Ecclesiastes was saying vanity, vanity, all is vanity. But then at the end of that book, he says, if you remember your sins, like you won't sin again. If you remember your death, you will not sin. And so I think that just the idea of remembering death gives a clarity that really should give us consolation. And we can touch on that a little bit more as we go on, but I want to give Jordan some time to speak here.
Absolutely. As Sarah weighs in from Wisconsin and Mary from Louisiana, and Mary says, she adds, her family has been closely affected by death this past year. Our consolation, she says, has been knowing the beauty of a holy death and the importance of praying for the dead. And Jordan, I think that's kind of what I was trying to allude to earlier, how not to be morose or always depressed about the idea of death, but the idea of meditating on it, helping us in life, is the tricky balance.
Yeah, and you know, you're talking about something that's been in the history and tradition of the church since its beginning. I mean, let's just talk about the death of Jesus on the cross. I mean, that death was necessary for everything that we're talking about now for salvation. That's the very easy and like low-hanging fruit, so to speak, not to diminish the sacrifice, of course, but in the context of the conversation, it is integral to the faith. You know, Jack, or they mentioned, I think in the video, and I think Jack mentioned it as well, Saint Jerome with the images of the skulls. I'm primarily Carmelite in spirituality, and if you look at Carmelite art, there's skulls everywhere. If you look at pictures, I think there's one of either Teresa of Avila, somebody. It's a Carmelite nun, and she's praying on her knees in front of her bed, and there's a crucifix on the wall, and there's a skull at the bottom of the crucifix. And if I remember tradition correctly, the skulls in that case, like I also have a plastic skull that I actually sold for my dad, but that sits in my prayer area, and I have a skull for the Our Father bead on my rosary. You know, this was common, and what we're doing now is just saying, hey, this isn't something to fear. This is something that you need to be aware of, and it's a tool to help you in your spiritual life. As Jack mentioned, you know, it helps stay away from sin. And it's important to think too, you know, well, why are we talking? This seems so morose. Well, it's because the world has made you believe that. Unfortunately, the world's constantly pushing off death, whether it's, you know, oh, I'll sleep when I'm dead. And what does that imply? Well, death will come at some point and I'm just going to rest. It's A, not taking it seriously, and B, pushing it off and into the, you know, back of your mind that you don't think about it. You know, how often do you wake up, number one, and give praise and think, okay, what happens if I die today? Where am I going to stand? Going back to what I said initially, well done, my good and faithful servant, or depart from me, I never knew you. You know, so these are the factors that we're talking about. And it sounds intense, but I think it only sounds intense because this tradition and this meditation and this understanding has really unfortunately been stripped away from our day in and day out. Although, like I said, it's important to note that it was the daily tradition and practice of those who came before us and who lived really holy lives. So yeah, no, I think it's just important to note that if you're ignoring death, you know, if you're not paying attention to where you're going to end up, you're aimless. And to steal a line from my dad, you know, he says, if you're aiming for purgatory, you have a hell of a backup plan. So, right. So this is your time now on earth is the opportunity to pursue virtue, and hopefully attain, you know, that unity with divine unity with God's will and join him in the beatific vision.
Good stuff there, Jordan, for sure. Sarah weighing in, saying in the secular, individualized world, it's easy for us to think that everything we do only affects us. But I think there's peace in knowing that everyone is affected by everything we do. It should shape the way we act. And you kind of touched on that a little bit earlier, Jack. You also mentioned that the first chapter of Meditations on Death was your favorite. You want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think that the reason why it was my favorite was it introduced an idea to me that I had never thought about before, and that is what the state of my soul and my body will be around the time of my death, and how that will affect my ability to repent. Because I think that one, I think about this kind of often is like, if I was confronted with death, would I be able to like go to my martyrdom? Like, I would like to think that I would, but like, would I? And so I have thought about like kind of that before, but I was thinking about like, oh, like, you know, because of what the book says, it talks of Thomas talks about how, you know, you are actually much weaker when you're about to die, so that your will is not as easily resolved to do what is right. And God, I mean, God willing, this doesn't happen to us, but some people end up becoming even weaker and end up cursing God, or end up at least like, you know, get more complaining about the fact that they're about to die than accepting about the fact that like, oh, I'm about to meet my judge, like I should ask for mercy, etc. And so I think that was very profound for me to just like sit there. Like as soon as I read that portion, I just like stopped reading the book for a while. I just like kept like thinking about that and reading those words and thinking like, wow, what will my reaction be whenever that hour confronts me? And I don't want to wait now until then to try and repent, but that I want to urge on my soul to repentance now, because I know that I'm at least strong. I mean, whenever I get sick, I start acting like a baby. So like, I can only imagine that whenever I'm about to die, that like I will be insufferable. So like, I need to work on transforming my will right now so that I can have a, you know, a happy death, as we pray for a lot in the church, as opposed to what would be like a quintessential like grumpy figure. I don't know, like the grumpy, the dwarf or whatever, like his death, just like mad. So yeah, that's kind of what like really stuck out to me in that chapter, that has really kind of transformed the way that I think about my death.
And I don't know about you guys, but it's the way that it's written too, kind of going into the first person and really being descriptive about it, made it easy for me, Jordan, to put myself in those shoes, kind of like Jack was talking about.
Yeah, that was a really unique aspect of this book that I've, as I mentioned, I haven't read a ton of books. I haven't really seen anything that goes this deep on particularly on death. And it was very fascinating. I really appreciated how he walked through, and I don't believe it's the first chapter, but how he walked through basically, okay, what if this happens? How are you? This might be how you respond. This might be how you act. And he basically gives out that meditation for you to walk along with. And it was very easy for me to put myself in that place. But it was particularly helpful, I think, because in the first chapter, he kind of describes the reality of what happens when we're God. I mean, I don't know what would be better I don't know if it'd be better if you just went and you didn't know, or if you saw it coming. You know, I don't know. I think that's a kind of up for debate. But if you get to that point and you see it coming and you're on the deathbed, like Jack said, how are you going to respond? And he gives you this, Thomas gives you this warning. He's like, are you aware? Do you know? He says at one point, at the point of death, a multitude of demons will appear before you, ready to seize upon your departed soul. And he gives them more descriptions. And this is echoed, if someone hears that and they think, well, that seems kind of crazy. This is echoed by Teresa of Avila. This is echoed by St. Jim McElgani. This is echoed by all these other saints who have experienced these different things and can tell you firsthand, no, this is what happens. Are you going to be prepared to fight? I think it was Teresa of Avila who actually wrote, for those who are on their deathbed, to hide the scissors or something along those lines, because it is that intense. But on to not make it so morose, but on a happier note, you know, understanding and walking through this meditation, what's the ideal end goal? And the ideal end goal is to be embraced in that beauty and that peace, and knowing you can stand before God and he can show all of your dirt to everybody, and you can say, "Thank you, Lord, I'm free. Thank you," and have him embrace you. And like, it's making me emotional now thinking about it, but that's the beauty of it. So if you have the understanding of the battle, you have the understanding of why you're fighting and why you have to engage in that battle. And I think Thomas just does a great job of walking you through in that meditation, kind of, okay, this is something, this may not be how it happens, but this very well could be. And this is what you need to be prepared for.
Catherine weighs in and says, athletes have a saying that we don't rise to the challenge, rather we sink to the level of our training or habitual actions, kind of what you were talking about a little bit, Jack. And it reminds me of in athletics as well. You do end up relying, it's all about what you've done to prepare, right? What you've done to get there so you can just be free in the moment and you don't have to think and the whole thing. And as you were talking about that, Jordan, to me, that seems to be, I think, a big hurdle for a lot of people is that I think they can recognize that it would be great to get through. I think there is a bit of a mental block, a lot of times a fear of pushing through that barrier. Jack, would you agree with that? The barrier of really meditating on death and seeing it on the other side of things, as opposed to just all the negative that might be included in the unknown.
Yeah, I mean, if we want to get a little bit more like philosophical on like, I guess, I mean, this is kind of highly theoretical, but when I think about it, like, to not remember your death is hell. Like, it's literally like a hellish existence, because typically when you're not remembering your death, you're not remembering that you're finite. You're not remembering that you're going to stand before a loving God, but also stand in comparison to Christ and see whether or not you lived up, and whether or not you became his, adopted brother and adopted son of the Father. And so if we live in such a way that we are not thinking about our death, typically whenever we don't think about our death, I sin a lot more. And I'm sure that y'all can attest to that too. You sin a lot more. You are you're more careless about your actions. You just behave in such a way that is unbecoming of being a human and being made in the image of God. So you're in a way living a hellish existence. I mean, I'm pretty sure that maybe Dostoevsky or somebody along the lines of some sort of Russian author, or maybe a Russian saint, said like hell is anywhere for those who don't love God. And I think that loving God, as we've seen in the lives of the saints, at least in some degree, has a direct correlation to us like remembering our death. And I think that the saints wouldn't be like, trying to look at death as like, oh, this horrible thing, but because they've experienced deeper union with God, through mystical encounter, through prayer, through the traditions of prayer of the church, which Jordan's family has done such a great job, popularizing more and more. They view death as this transfigured reality in which there's actually great comfort. It's not something that we should fear. And so I think that for those who may struggle with meditating on their death, I would suggest like getting within the lives of the saints and reading them, going and checking out, the various publications that Tan Books has from the saints. I mean, you've got some great works from St. Francis de Sales. Introduction to the Devout Life is a great introductory book for any Roman Catholic who's interested in the spiritual tradition of the Roman Catholic Church. And I mean, Jordan's family, Dan's got a lot of great stuff online to just introduce like bare minimum to the kind of the mystical tradition of the church, which I think really is what gives us solace and can make people look at death as a happy thing, as a joyful thing. I think those are kind of my take on that part.
You see it similarly, Jordan, kind of sometimes a barrier for being able to think about death in a positive way is that fear, anxiety, whatever negative emotions might be attached to death specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in my estimation, just looking at my own life and how I kind of handled and tackled that question over the years and having conversations with hundreds and thousands of people, I think too many people, because again, I did this as well. They think of the final judgment and they focus on the word judgment. But what they don't realize is really two things that kind of are maybe two sides of the same coin, possibly. And that's one side is we brought this upon ourselves. So whatever judgment comes from our actions, right? But B, they don't often think about the fact that this isn't just some benevolent God who is saying, well, you did this, 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 and this, you're going to hell. What about the fact that we know that he's a good and loving God, and maybe he's weeping over the loss of his children because we chose that. We chose to deny him. We chose the other path. I mean, I would hope that some theologian or saint has written on this, but my suspicion is this is a great day of sorrow, even for God in a way. It's like, God, these are my kids. Like I gave you every opportunity to turn to me. I gave you every opportunity to join me, but you chose the other path. And I think if we shift our focus, and I do believe that's why the saints, when we read their conversations about death or their writings on death, it's joyous, right? And sometimes it comes off as like, well, they just want to go be with God. Like, I get it, but it's also this love. It's mirroring that love, right? They know how God loves them and they want to mirror that back. And this is the other facet of death. Meditations on death. It's not just the end, but dying to yourself every day. And what is the motivation to die to yourself every day? It should be love. So there's this like kind of beautiful cyclical relationship between these things, that if we can just kind of shift our focus just slightly from this fear and this judgment, and it is a judgment and you should be afraid, and that's okay to be motivated by fear in the beginning, but eventually if you want to live as the saints lived, and if you want to have a better ending, then you should shift your focus from that fear and obeying out of fear to obeying out of love and choosing virtue out of love.
Little Flower is the account weighing in with a suggestion, so reading suggestion of Preparation for Death by St. Alphonsus Liguori. Jack, you were talking about some other good resources when thinking about this subject for sure. And Catherine had mentioned earlier about athletes not rising to the challenge but falling to the level of preparation. Reminded me also of how athletes say you got to get comfortable being uncomfortable, and that's how growth happens. And I feel like in this topic that applies as well. The more I speak about it with you guys, the more I read about it with Thomas à Kempis, the more I think settled might be the right word. The more settled I feel about this entire topic, and maybe able to. I find myself being able to see it maybe a little bit more clearly. What about you, Jack?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I was going to bring this up as soon as she made that reference to the athletes. Father David Abernathy, for those of y'all who have never heard of him, he's an Eastern Catholic priest who is like one of the leading, I guess people in the world on the Desert Fathers. And he has a podcast called Philokalia Ministries, really holy man. And he was in one of his book clubs on the Ladder of Divine Ascent, which is an ancient Egyptian text from around the year 500 to 600 AD. And he was talking about in this group how, people, when they're, an athlete's running or training for a marathon, they not only just like run at a certain time of the day, but they like drink water throughout the day in order to prepare for that run. They wake up at a certain time. They do certain things. And so we have this meticulous attention to detail when we know we're preparing for an event in this area of our life, but like how few of us have this meticulous attention to detail in the spiritual life. And this is part of the spiritual life, is the fact that we will die. So whenever we can actually like look at our death and see it and recognize that it's going to happen, then we can start to live our lives in such a way that we are prepared for it. So like the fact that I remember my death by the grace of God for one moment may end up making me be a little kinder to the next person I encounter whenever I'm stressed out, and so that enables me. It's actually interesting. Me seeing my death clearly kind of humbles me as a creature and makes me more apt to act in a way that is virtuous. There's something proper about it that it actually encourages us to virtue rather than encouraging us to some sort of like fear.
It reminds me exactly kind of what you were saying there a little bit earlier, Jordan, about just slightly shifting your perspective. And that can make all the difference. Laura asks, what was the most influencing or moving part of the book? Jack, I feel like you touched on that a little earlier, saying the beginning for you. Jordan, what about you? You have an answer for Laura there?
Yeah, I'd say it's tied, either between the meditation or in the first chapter, how we kind of described what happens in hell.
Yeah.
A lot of my study is in demonology and angelology, and it mirrored pretty exactly some of the books I've been going through. But particularly understanding that, whatever vice you are tempted to in this life, if you succumb to that, that is going to be the vice and the demon in hell that torments you. And it torments you in a particular way. I think he mentioned, if you suffer with sloth, there's a demon that's going to make you work constantly. And so that was a really interesting thing to keep in mind, where it's like, okay, this guy's gunning for me. And then when you're shifting perspective, when you put it in a perspective of God's ultimate plan and his divine will, if you're being tempted in that way, God's permitting it so that you can choose the opposing virtue and become the person that you have, that he's called you to be. So it just is a reminder and a reiteration of all these different things that I've read over the years, and it's impactful, and it's nice that it was something that was that impactful in such a small text.
Sarah weighs in, says, in my opinion, it was the chapter about time wasted on Earth, and Patty agrees. And Jack, I see you shaking your head or nodding your head.
I think that, time and time again, you get studies done by whatever a Pew Research poll or whatever the new popular research industry is, that says like people at the end of their death regret not taking more chances, or at least just like not living life in such a way that is people agonize over time that they wasted. That they did use on something that I'm sure at the time they didn't think they were wasting time. Like, who actually wastes time? Like, we do, but like, who like sits there and is like, you know what? I'm really just going to like not like do something leisureful for a while, or I probably just created a word, but do something that is restorative, but just somebody that's like, yeah, I'm gonna waste time. Like, nobody categorizes it that way, but we all do it. It's kind of like St. Thomas Aquinas saying that nobody ever chooses the evil thinking that it's like evil. They choose it in some way thinking that it's a good. Like they even if they may be misled or completely in delusion, well, obviously they're misled, they think it's good for them in some sort of capacity. I think that I think that it's really significant to make sure that we are doing the most with the time that we have. And a way in which we can make sure that we do that is by remembering the fact that we have time. and that's not saying we have a lot of time. That's just saying that we are bound by time. We're not gods. We are not little g gods is what I mean, but we are bound by time. And we can partake in the life of God and live forever, but we have to have a body and a soul, a person made fit for that by the time that we transfigure and pass into the next life.
Regrets, and it's typically inaction as opposed to regretting the action that you take. That's what I kind of got from the wasting of time, what you're talking about there. And Jordan, back to your description of, the description in this book of hell was unlike anything I've ever come across in my life. Just how vivid the imagery stuck with me, especially the smell that just
Right,
sticks with you and makes the person in there, as Thomas A. Kempis describes it, choking on their breath over and over again. And then on the flip side of that too, not to just stick to the negative, there are a lot more pages in Meditations on Death on heaven, I believe, than on hell, and just describing the beauty and having that optimistic end of the spectrum as well was really part of what made me appreciate this book as much as I do, Jordan.
No, I totally agree. I totally agree. You, and if anyone who's been listening closely, they can tell I'm trying to say the hard thing and then follow it up with something a little bit lighter and more beautiful. Because if you focus on strictly the negative, then yeah, you're going to spin out of control. It's like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? I don't want to end up here. Oh, this sounds terrible. It sounds terrible. It's like, okay, yeah, it is terrible. That's the reality. Okay, what are you going to do? Go do something to avoid it. And in terms of talking about wasting time, I love that chapter as well. I don't know if Jack and I are in the same men's group. I don't know if he remembers this, but a couple months ago, we had a younger guy join, and we had a conversation that sparked about how you're spending your time. And my argument was, yeah, there is, you should rest, and there is leisure. I mean, that's part of it. Sunday, you're supposed to rest. But in your activities, could you not choose the more virtuous activity? Even in those, right? So that taking that wasting time a little bit deeper. It's like, okay, yeah, I can read a book, but what are you reading, right? What is it? Is it good, true, right, holy? That sort of a thing. It's, I don't know. This all is, death is just this one facet, and it opens into such a large chasm of all these other little things that are involved. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but that's kind of what came to mind.
Oh, absolutely. Jack, did the descriptions of heaven and hell stick with you from Meditations on Death as well?
Yeah, definitely. And I always find it fascinating to think about, why. So like, why would there, be a demon, torturing you in this certain way? And why would God allow it? But I remember like meditating upon just the nature of hell. It's somewhere where like there's a lack of everything that's good for the most part outside of your like people exist in hell, so that's a good thing, the fact that people exist. But outside of existence, pretty much everything there is evil, which means that it lacks a good. And so you have everybody that in hell is probably beating up on each other the entire time, and obviously we are not higher than the fallen angels. So if we end up in hell, then we're going to be subservient to them the rest of our life. And it's not like God sitting there just like extracting vengeance for vengeance sake, but it's just kind of the natural like consequence if you think about it. Like that's just the reality. If you have, along with the fallen angel, said, nope, I don't love God, and I don't want to love God, I don't want to love others, then you're going to be in an all-out war for the rest of your life, as opposed to the bliss of heaven. So I thought that was very good. One thing I wanted to add on to something that Jordan was saying earlier about kind of transitioning from a more gloomy attitude about death to a more positive one is I've been reminded about the words that hopefully future saint, but Pope Benedict the 16th said before his death. And he was talking about how, looking back on the course of his life, like he has much reason for fear and trembling. And I'm sure that, maybe those of us who followed his pontificate closely at all, like may have some inkling of what he's probably thinking about. But he said that like, in the light of my death, the joy of being a Christian becomes even more clear, because I'm not going to stand just before a judge, but a judge that's my brother and is my friend and that loves me and gave himself for me. And so like the grace of being a Christian becomes all the more clear, like whenever we, consider death. And so I think that that's definitely an angle that we should keep in mind is not only Christ, like the one who loves us, but I think that really that image of brother, like who here has like a brother or a sibling that wants to like see them like, go to hell or to suffer. Like God ultimately wants us to choose the good. That's why he created us. And so I think that can be a sort of grounding point for, launching into meditations on death, is the fact that, Christ has already come and stripped death of all of its power. He already went into Mordor and burned the ring. So I'm sorry, I've been watching Lord of the Rings, so I love the references to the harrowing of Hades. So yeah.
Oh, we've got a whole course, a whole 10 course on the Lord of the Rings and the Christian imagery and illusions, I believe, and how it's woven in there by Tolkien there.
Yeah.
Jack, man, really appreciate your time. The What is Truth podcast. Jordan, you as well, do the harder thing. Jordan, any final thoughts here as we wrap up this Book of the Year Club meeting that we really appreciate you being on, man?
I'm very thankful to be here. This was a very edifying discussion, and I would just encourage, if people are on the fence, get it, pray it, read it, and you'll be all right. Trust Jesus. Jesus is Lord. Trust in God.
Good final words from you for sure. What about you, Jack?
Yeah, just think about your death. I mean, you only have one chance to do it. You only have one life to live. So I think that this is a way in which to make that life more meaningful. I think this book is so suitable for entry level. You do not have to be a theologian or quote unquote theologian. I mean, a theologian's just one who truly prays, but you don't have to have like the IQ, like a 160 IQ or whatever it may be, to read this book. It's incredible. So definitely get it, think about it, pray about it. And yeah, get closer to Christ. That's the only way that we're going to have a happy death. So
Patty, Laura, Anitra, we appreciate you expressing your gratitude, joining us here on the live stream. You mentioned get the book, Jordan, if you haven't already. Well, we're going to give away a free copy of the book. Janet Ford is our winner today, joining us on the live stream here. Well done, Janet. We'll get that copy of Meditations to Death to you. And if you would like to buy it, just by checking out this Book of the Year Club live stream there, you can get a 25% discount. Just use the special discount code MOD25, MOD25 for a limited time only. We'll end with you today. By the way, check these guys out on Instagram as well. What is Truth Pod for Jack? And then Jordan is do_harder thing there, where you can find him on Instagram. But we'll leave you with a part of our podcast. You can go to spiritualmasterspodcast.com to see the whole thing. But another portion of that podcast that our TAM publisher, Connor Gallagher, did with the translator of Meditations on Death, Father Robert Nixon. Really appreciate you guys being a part. We'll have another Book of the Year Club meeting and live stream next month as well. But that will do it for now. We'll let Father Nixon, Father Robert, take us out here today.
Everything that we're doing, which we're aspiring to do, you think, if I'm struggling about something, if I'm anxious about something, at the moment of death, is it really going to matter all of that much?
Yeah.
And then the choice between a good action or a wicked action or no action at all, and which one are you going to prefer when you come to that final point? So it's keeping the end always in mind. And I think he's quite right in saying that this is a universal remedy for all of our moral uncertainties and everything, all of our temptations.